All right, Deuteronomy 18, beginning at verse 15. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your fellow Israelites. You must listen to him. For this is what you asked of the Lord your God at Horeb on the day of the assembly, when you said, "Let us not hear the voice of the Lord our God, nor see his great fire anymore, or we will die." The Lord said to me, this is Moses talking, the Lord said to me, "What they say is good. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their fellow Israelites, and I will put my words in his mouth. He will tell them everything I command him. I myself will call to account anyone who does not listen to my words that the prophet speaks in my name. But a prophet who presumes to speak in my name anything I have not commanded, or a prophet who speaks in the name of other gods, is to be put to death." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Congregation, loved by Jesus Christ, it was 1991, and we were nearing the end of the Persian Gulf War. Remember Operation Desert Storm. And CNN was carrying 24-hour coverage of that war. Remember that? And that was a new thing, to have a 24-hour news cycle. That was before our cell phones was reminding us every minute or so about the latest news. And at that time, the war in the south of the country of Iraq was sort of wrapping up. The Allies were wrapping that up, and then Saddam Hussein turned his attention to the Kurds living in the north. You remember that? And he was bombing the Kurds, and they had fled out of northern Iraq across the border into eastern Turkey, and the UN had set up refugee camps for people who were living in those camps, those refugees in those camps. Remember that? And CNN had their pictures and their stories all over the news. And that resulted in a bunch of Christian Reformed folks being moved with compassion who wrote checks and sent them into CRWRC, now World Renew. And the folks at CRWRC said, "What are we going to do with this money? Let's help." So they came up with an idea to send a team of people to go to eastern Turkey and figure out if there was something that we could do to help the refugees that were on the news 24 hours a day. And somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody had heard about this young couple in Byron Center, Michigan, Mike and Lisa Hoogeboom, and they were going to Turkey anyway, so why don't you talk to them and see if they have anything to say. And a month later, we were on an airplane from Grand Rapids to Istanbul on our way to eastern Turkey with another team member. His name was John. John was retired military and then had also retired from his career in lumber business. And the adventure just began at that point. We got to Istanbul, and I have the whole story written down, but I don't have enough time to tell it, so I'll just tell you this bit, and this will give you a sense. We couldn't fly all the way to Diyarbakir, which is the city we were headed for in far eastern Turkey, so we had to fly and then take a 5-hour bus ride. Well, Turkish hospitality, being as it is, as I've explained before, where the guest is treated like royalty, meant we got the very front seat behind the driver on the bus, which meant that we had a 5-hour unobstructed view of a cat and mouse game of chicken on a 2-lane highway every time our bus driver decided to pass the vehicle in front of us, which was every time. No matter if we were going uphill or downhill, we were passing. It was a miracle that we arrived in Diyarbakir. It was a miracle that we survived Diyarbakir. Diyarbakir is a frontier town, far eastern Turkey, in every sense of the word. It is the crossroads for thieves and smugglers, for shopkeepers and family farmers, for students and European backpackers. It's a wild place. Our friend, John, team member, had already arranged for us to arranged a hotel for us. So we had a place to stay, and that night we found a rental car. There's no Hertz rent-a-car on the frontier in eastern Turkey, so the car came from the neighbor of the brother-in-law of the guy at the front desk of our hotel. A crisp $100 bill, and we didn't even have to sign a release form or insurance. The next day, we got in the car with our translator, who, by the way, frontier town, listen to this. He could speak French and English, Kurdish, Turkish, and some Arabic. We took off for the border and ended up there. Our first stop was the military base. U.S. Army had a base there alongside the refugee camp. And it was at that point where John flashed his military ID. We got in to see the commanding officer, and then we learned, and this is where that bit about CNN comes in, that the border had opened for Kurds, and they had left the refugee camp to go back and resettle themselves in their own homes and their villages and towns, and the refugee camp was nearly empty and emptying as people moved back to northern Iraq. We didn't want to give up hope that maybe we could still go and help, and so we talked to a lieutenant, M16s thrown over his shoulder, and he had just gotten out of northern Iraq the day before, and he said he was glad to be back on this side of the border. They were deliberately had to pull the troops out. That was the agreement, because now the warlords were taking pot shots at each other. So I forgot to leave out, we were 25 years old at the time. We thought, when you're 25, you remember being 25, you think that you're bulletproof? That's until you have a lieutenant of the U.S. Army saying, I'm glad to be out of there. So I looked at John, and John looked at Lisa, and Lisa looked at me, and I said, I think we're not going to be able to go into northern Iraq. And Lisa said, the border's closed, always practical. And John said, no, this is the end of the line. And it was the end of the line of all the activity for sure, but it was also the end of our sense of call to mission. It was the end of a fire to go and help someone who needed help. It was the end of what were we going to do with all this money that CRWRC had received from compassionate folks back in the United States. And so we turned around and went back. Now, it's not a direct parallel, but for God's people, Israel, who have just been through the wilderness and are standing there at the borderline of the promised land, about to enter in, they too are experiencing the dying of a dream, because Moses is about to die. And the question they're asking themselves is what will happen when Moses dies? Moses, who was God's mediator, God's prophet to the Israelites, that first generation, right? All of them now have died, and their tombs are scattered throughout the wilderness where they had been for 40 years. Will God, who was with our ancestors, our grandparents and our parents, will God go with us into this new land now that Moses has died? They were wondering whether all the risk and the sacrifice and the traveling was actually worth it, or was it all for nothing? So they stand there on that border between the wilderness and the promised land, and they are alone. Is all the wilderness, is it all worth it? Or is it all for nothing? Nick Walterstorff, you've heard his name, I think. Some of you have. He is graduate from Calvin College, and then later taught philosophy for many years at the college. And then, even then, from there, he also served as visiting professor. I realized, I didn't know this before, he served here at U of M and at Oxford and Yale and Notre Dame. His son, 27 years old, died in a mountain climbing accident. And he wrote about that lament. It's called A Lament for a Son in a little book. And I think he gets at what the Israelites are experiencing, the fear and the questions that come by losing Moses, their prophet. Here's what Nick writes. There's a hole in the world now. In the place where he was, there's now just nothing. A center like no other of memory and hope and knowledge and affections, which once inhabited this earth, is gone. A gap remains. A person, an irreplaceable person, is gone. Never again will anyone apprehend the world quite the way that he did. Never again will anyone inhabit the world the way he did. Questions I have for him can never now get answers. The world is emptier. Only a hole remains, a void, a gap, never to be filled. I think that begins to capture what the Israelites are asking, experiencing at the fear, the loss, the hole, the gap that Moses leaves when he dies and they are faced to enter the promised land without him. Is all of the sacrifice and all of the risk for nothing? Because this second generation, when they lose Moses, they are losing their center. Moses is irreplaceable. Never again will anyone teach the law of God the way that Moses teaches the law of God, having received it there on Mount Sinai. Never again will any prophet in Israel practice living out the law of God the way that Moses lived out the law of God in their midst for the last 40 years. Never again will there be a prophet who establishes the sacrifices and worship that reconciles people's hearts with the heart of God. So Moses preaches the book of Deuteronomy, this sermon of Deuteronomy to the second generation, who are asking themselves whether all the sacrifice was worth it, or was it all for nothing? And the good news to this generation standing on the borderline between the wilderness and the promised land is this: I will raise up, verse 18, I will raise up for them a prophet like you, Moses, from among their fellow Israelites, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he will tell them everything that I have commanded you. Friends, the good news is that God provides the prophet to replace Moses, Joshua, right? And then every generation since, not just this second generation, but then the third generation and the fourth, prophet after prophet who comes to inhabit and translate and live out God's law of love for God and love for neighbor, generation after generation after generation, until we get to Jesus Christ. Right? Jesus then is the final fulfillment of this promise. And by his incarnation, Jesus fills the hole at the center of our relationship with God the Father. Just as Moses launches a new kingdom through his life and death, Jesus, the prophet, launches a new creation through his ministry, life, death, and resurrection. Jesus the prophet, among us, God's people, taught like no other prophet taught, because he taught those who others thought were unteachable. Jesus the prophet, he demonstrated God's law of love because he loved those who others thought were unlovable, even his own enemies, when he forgave them from the cross. Jesus the prophet demonstrated the law of love when he gave of himself to die on the cross and then was raised up, the Lord of life, and launched a new creation. Jesus, the prophet, is at the center of our life with God, the center of our worship, in such a way that our worship unites our hearts with the heart of God. Which leaves, I think, one last question for us. For you and I'm wondering, where do you find yourself today standing at a borderline? Asking yourself, was all the risk, was all the work, was all the suffering, was the sacrifice worth it? Or was it all for nothing? I think of parents sending their children off to school, whether it's kindergarten or middle school or high school or college, or shoving them out of the nest. Was it worth it? Are they going to be okay? I think of children caring for parents who are declining and asking themselves, is all the risk and the sacrifice worth it? I think of aging parents worried that they're going to be a burden to their children. Will it be worth it? But it's not just those folks who stand at the borderline. Some of us today stand at this borderline, and there is a fire burning in our hearts. A mission, a vision of a world where there's no need for a rotating shelter because everyone is housed. A vision of prisons that have been transformed into schools, of hospitals into health centers, of swords into plowshares and tanks into combines. And folks who have that vision burning in their souls of the mission of God in this world look around and say, sometimes, on their bad days maybe, was it worth it? Friends, as we stand together, looking into a future, whatever question we have, I want to end by considering a vision by John, the disciple of Jesus. There's debate, but I'm going to say the disciple of Jesus in Revelation chapter 7. And remember, he saw people from every language and tribe and nation. And they were circling the hosts of heaven, the angels of heaven, who then were encircling the four living creatures who were all gathered around a lamb who had been slain but was now alive. And friends, congregation loved by Jesus Christ, that prophet will not fail. That prophet who died and rose again, His mission on this earth will not fail. That prophet is the last prophet, and as it is at the very center of all this new creation. Thanks be to God.